Chiefs news, analysis, and opinion every day. The Kansas City Chiefs went absolutely ham today, adding to the defensive line for the practice squad. And guys, I don't think that is the end game for these players. We're going to get into that in this video. And I want to let you know that this will be a 2-video day, possibly a 3-video day about the Kansas City Chiefs. The only thing I talk about on this channel. There will be videos later, at least one video later, about these players. There is a full video about Brodric Martin signed just a couple days ago. So if you are interested in thoughts on Brodric Martin and what he brings to the roster, that video is already live. And I think that there are some things brewing with this list of players, and we're going to get into some numbers, some math, addition and subtraction at least. So this is what happened today. We're going to go over defensive tackle and defensive end in this video. The defense has 24 players on the 53-man roster. The split for an even 53 would be 25 offense, 25 defense. Last year, they took 26 offense and 24 defense. They did the very same thing this year, but likely that was because of all of the Rashee Rice drama. So at defensive tackle, the Kansas City Chiefs currently list Chris Jones, Derek Nottie, Jerry Tillery, and Omar Norman-Lott on their 53-man roster, having removed Keziah Izzard, Fabian Levette, Mike Pennell, the surprise cut, and Marlon Tuipulotu from the roster. The move was explained by Brett Veach as trying to get younger and more athletic at defensive tackle. That's why they got rid of Mike Pennell. That was a surprise even for me, so much of a surprise for me that when I went over the initial 53, I just glossed over the defensive tackle spot and didn't even realize at first that they had cut Mike Pennell. I just assumed that he was going to be on the roster. I assumed so hard that I negated the visual evidence that he was not on the roster. So one thing that really surprised me, and we're going to get into the players that they signed, is that the defensive tackle position for the Kansas City Chiefs in the 2024 season fielded just 4 players. There were only 4 players who took snaps at defensive tackle for the Chiefs all season last year. I think it's going to be different this year. And obviously, some of Chris Jones' snaps were at defensive end, some of Charles Omenihu's snaps were at defensive tackle, etc. But we're going to go with the assumption that this is the blueprint heading into the 2025 season. Marlon Tuipulotu played just 61 snaps. So you had 4 players, just 4 players take snaps at defensive tackle, and one of them took fewer than 65 snaps all season. Derek Nottie played 221 snaps for the Chiefs. Chris Jones played a massive 771 snaps. And then Tershawn Wharton, the dearly departed Tershawn Wharton, 667 snaps. And you see Chris Jones playing 0 special teams there, meaning that Tershawn Wharton and Derek Nottie had to basically share the team's defensive tackle special teams snaps, as Marlon Tuipulotu played just 7. Tershawn Wharton took 73 special team snaps, and Derek Nottie took 62. So, not a whole lot of defensive tackle action on the special teams in general, but there were 1,071 total snaps at defensive tackle for the Chiefs, which comes out to just 63 snaps per game at the position. This is what I think this would look like in the 2025 season, assuming 1,071 snaps. Just copy-pasted Chris Jones' 771 snaps into the next line, right? That would come out to 45 snaps per game. If Chris Jones is ready to play, he will play almost the entire game. You're looking at an entire game usually being between 50 and 65-ish snaps. For Chris Jones here, taking off the final week of the season, 771 snaps total, 45 snaps per game, as the depth chart is currently listed. I would expect Derek Nottie to take around 500 snaps. That would be more than double what he took last year. I don't think that is a good position for the Kansas City Chiefs to be in. Derek Nottie is a run-stuffing defensive tackle, a pretty good run-stuffing defensive tackle, but offers very little in the pass rush department. That would be, for Derek Nottie, 30 snaps per game. I don't think that is what the Chiefs want to do. Omar Norman Lott I have currently listed as 300 snaps, which would put him at third on last year's depth chart, but it would be way more than the third place Derek Nottie took at 221 snaps. It would be 79 more snaps per game, or per season. That would put him at 18 snaps per game. Probably the Chiefs expect more than that from him, but he is entering the season with a little bit of a hang-up with his ankle, and he has not looked as explosive this preseason as he looked on film in college. Is that a problem? Is that him gaining the weight and not adjusting yet? I don't know. 18 snaps per game is not a terribly low number, but probably it's less than you would expect from someone who was drafted as high as he was. I just don't know that he's going to be the 500 snap, 30 snap per game model of defensive tackle. That was the big knock on him coming out of college, was that he did not play a whole lot of snaps per game. If you expect that same type of deployment for Omar Norman Lott in the NFL, 18 snaps per game is probably where he becomes the freshest, where he becomes the pass rushing defensive tackle that they are hoping to have from him. That would put Jerry Tillery. I keep wanting to call him Derek and Jerry Tillery. Jared Tillery. I don't know why, but Jerry Tillery at 150 snaps on the season, which would be 9 snaps per game, which is way more than the fourth defensive tackle Marlon Tuipulotu took last year at just 61. Again, I don't think that this is the final number for this roster. I do not think that the Chiefs will field only 4 defensive tackles in the 2025 season. I think that is a big reason why they have currently listed 3 defensive tackles on their practice squad. Marlon Tuipulotu, a holdover from last year. Brodric Martin, for whom there is a video, once again, on the channel already. And then the recently signed, so Brodric Martin was recently signed, but the recently signed, not yet, featured on the Scrambling Armchair, which I'm sure he's waiting for, Zacch Pickens, who I think of this group of defensive linemen that were signed, this is the haul. Zacch Pickens is the haul here, defensive tackle. I think that this is going to be a 53-man roster guy at some point this season. There's several different reasons to have people on the practice squad, right? You want veterans on your practice squad because if someone goes down, they can step in immediately and play that role and hopefully not have too much of a drop-off. Marlon Tuipulotu is kind of the guy that falls into that. He knows the defense and everything. He's been here for a while. Brodric Martin, I think, is signed possibly to be a 53-man roster guy. He is a run-stuffing defensive tackle. I think he might be better than Jerry Tillery right now. And Derek Nottie, I think if you're Brodric Martin, that's the guy that you're watching in practice saying, this is the role I want. I want the run-stuffing defensive tackle role. If you look at the 4 players listed on the 53-man roster, Chris Jones and Omar Norman Lott are kind of pass rushers. Derek Nottie, a run stuffer. Jerry Tillery, sort of a multi-use defensive tackle, probably phases more heavily into the run-stuffing role than the pass-rushing role. And that is sort of the split. 2 pass rushers, 2 run-stuffers. Brodric Martin, I think, is, again, more talented than Jerry Tillery. I think he could eventually be a 53-man roster guy. Zacch Pickens, I think, is signed, maybe not immediately because he doesn't know the defense, etc. You're getting him right before the season starts, etc. But I think Zacch Pickens is signed to be one of these 53-man roster guys. We don't know the exact terms for the Derek Nottie trade. It could be that if the Chiefs get out of the Derek Nottie business soon enough, they do not owe that draft pick to the Jets. I don't know the terms and conditions of the trade, but I think if you're the Chiefs, You don't want to be in the Derek Nottie 500 snap per season business any longer. They tried pretty hard, it seemed, to get out of the Derek Nottie business for a couple years. And that is the nature of the defensive tackle position in the NFL. To be that big and that capable at stopping the run and rushing the passer is difficult business. You saw this on cutdown day. Not a whole lot of action at the defensive tackle spot around the NFL. These players are very hard to get your hands on. That's why they go so high in the draft. With the exception of the run-stuffing defensive tackles, there is a premium on defensive tackle in the draft. So, because of the nature of the position, it's so hard to play. If you think you have a defensive tackle that can make a difference in both stopping the run and rushing the passer, you take him pretty high so that you have him on your roster. You will overdraft those players, and Zacch Pickens may have been a victim of that, and that's why he found himself on the receiving end of a pink slip on Turk Day. Now, not Turk Wharton, but Turk Day is in the guy who comes around and makes the cuts. So that is what's going on at defensive tackle. I think that the Chiefs I think it's a good sign that the Chiefs are still being active here. Again, very difficult to find these players, so you take a lot of swings. I don't think they want 3 defensive tackles on their practice squad all season for a position that has 63 snaps per game, and you have just 4 players who took snaps last year. You don't want that large of apportionment of your practice squad to be towards the defensive tackle position. So I don't know if I ever got to the rest of this. A couple reasons to have players on the practice squad are, 1, you think they can step in and make a difference. 2, you have a young guy that you think you can develop into something. That's where Brodric Martin and Zacch Pickens stay here. Marlon Tuipulotu was brought in for that reason and just kind of never developed very much. Marlon Tuipulotu on the practice squad probably as insurance. I don't know if Marlon Tuipulotu will last the entire season on the practice squad. If you end up moving Zacch Pickens to your active roster and cutting Jerry Tillery, for example, Jerry Tillery is one of those guys who could find his way back onto your practice squad as insurance. You can bring him up in a snap, and he ends up playing for your defense, stepping in right away. So that would make, in my opinion, more sense having Jerry Tillery on the practice squad than Brodric Martin and or Zacch Pickens. But again, you couldn't roster that many guys. You couldn't justify rostering that many guys for a position that survived on just 4 players last season. And last season was not the greatest season for the Chiefs defensively, but it was still a pretty good season. They just had some trouble getting to the quarterback. This guy right here, I think, offers more pop in the pass rush than Jerry Tillery or Derek Nottie. Then you have defensive end. The Chiefs kept 5, George Karlaftis, Charles Omenihu, Mike Dana, Ashton Gelati, and Malik Herring, with obviously Felix Anudike-Uzomah going on the IR and Janarius Robinson going on the IR as well. But Owen Carney and Nate Matlack were cut, not a big surprise. They were added late. There was not a whole lot of names out there at defensive end. But in the 2024 season, Malik Herring played 193 snaps. That was the most he had ever played. I do not think that was in the plans for the Chiefs going into last season. Felix Anudike-Uzomah, I was surprised, was 3rd in snaps for the Chiefs last season. Obviously, Charles Omenihu missed some time, but Felix Anudike-Uzomah played 332 snaps for the team on defense last year. The special teams we'll get to in a moment. Very surprising to me as well. Charles Omenihu played just 225 snaps. Mike Dana played 496 snaps. I do not think that is where he is the strongest. And George Karlaftis played 831 snaps. An absolute monster for this Chiefs defense. On the special teams side, you had George Karlaftis play 65 snaps of special teams. That is nearly 10 snaps per game on special teams, 5 snaps per game on special teams. I do not think you want to do that. I think you want to get George Karlaftis off the field on special teams, but I don't think you could afford to do that. Last year, Charles Omenihu, a veteran, playing 0 special team snaps. Probably that's going to carry into this season. FAU played just 11, and Malik Herring played 7. So this spot here, the Felix Anudike-Uzomah role for the Chiefs last year, that third defensive end, really the fourth defensive end for most of the season, should be getting a lot more than 11 special team snaps because you had Mike Dana playing 48, you had George Karlaftis playing 65. I don't think you want to be in that business. There were 2,077 snaps at defensive end for the Chiefs last season, meaning there were 122 snaps per game at defensive tackle, or defensive end, pardon me. I'm all out of sorts right now. 831 for George Karlaftis comes out to 49 snaps per game if you're projecting these snaps onto the 2025 season. So George Karlaftis playing the exact same thing next year. That comes out to 49 snaps per game. He's kind of the Chris Jones at the defensive end position. That's kind of your staple. That's probably where he's going to play. Mike Dana, I would suggest playing around 400 snaps, the same as Ashton Gillotte. Each of those players having 24 snaps per game. Ashton Gillotte very well might earn his way into that second starting role, which would mean more than 400 snaps on the year. Charles Omenihu, I still don't think you want to play him terribly much. Again, going to double some as a defensive tackle, same with George Karlaftis. And 300 snaps per game comes out to 18 snaps per game, or 300 snaps on the season comes out to 18 snaps per game. Malik Herring with 146 snaps then, which would be 9 snaps per game. I think they want out of the Malik Herring business. I do not think they did. I do not think they wanted to roster Malik Herring this year. And if you are Tyreke Smith or Ethan Downs, the 2 players added to the practice squad yesterday, you have your eyes on Malik Herring during practice saying, that's the role I want. I want to earn that role. I think that there is a possibility that Malik Herring becomes one of the players who is rostered on the 53 initially, ends up coming off, replaced by Tyreke Smith or Ethan Downs, possibly someone else as the season goes on. The rosters, I don't think, around the NFL are completely settled yet. As you saw, this second move with the Kansas City Chiefs, you will see second moves, second waves with every team in the NFL as the dust settles. Week 3 of the season, for example, Malik Herring ends up getting cut. Tyreke Smith takes his place on the 53. You're going to have that around the NFL, so there will be other defensive ends that find themselves available. 2 edge players on the practice squad is much more comfortable than 3 defensive tackles on the practice squad. So, if you were taking that into account, the defensive tackle position for the Chiefs might end up getting shaved on the practice squad, being that they carry 1 or 2, which would open up 1 or 2 more spots. This 2 defensive ends on the practice squad, I think, does make sense. You could find one of them replacing Malik Herring. Malik Herring very easily could find himself back on the practice squad because he is a player that is dependable for who Malik Herring is, right? Malik Herring entering the league as a UDFA has found a role for the Kansas City Chiefs, and that is something that is a win, right? Bringing in a UDFA who has been on the 53 for so long is a win for Brett Veach and this organization. But again, I think they wanted to get out of the Malik Herring business. So Ethan Downs and Tyreke Smith, pardon me, might find themselves on the 53 at some point. Rostering 5 defensive ends, probably within the purview. I would expect more than 5 players to be taking snaps at defensive end for the Kansas City Chiefs this season, because I do think that Malik Herring will get into the game early in the season and possibly find himself on the outs, depending on how he plays. I mean, we've seen an incredibly consistent Malik Herring during his time in the NFL, which is part of the reason he went undrafted. Another part was because he had an injury his final year in college. He was a massive disruptor in college. He was a guy that you would have thought would have at least been drafted. if not for that injury. So I think that the 53-man roster for the Chiefs is going to be in a little bit of flux going forward. It would not shock me to see Tyreke Smith on the roster at edge. When I was doing the mock drafts the year that Tyreke Smith came out, I mocked him to the Kansas City Chiefs quite a bit in those later rounds. I do think that there is some value there. I do think that he does add some range as a pass rusher as well as an edge setter. So I think that he can earn NFL reps, especially over someone like Malik Herring, who has earned NFL reps his entire NFL career after he came back from that injury, right? These moves, Brodric Smith, Zacch Pickens, Tyreke Smith, Ethan Downs, I still have to get into a little bit. There will be a Tyreke Smith and an Ethan Downs video on the channel at some point, either today, possibly tomorrow. I think they're going to be stronger at the defensive line positions than they are heading into the year because of these moves. I don't know that either of these players, and this is a weird thing to say, add as much pop as Felix Anudike-Uzomah, who we saw in his snap counts for productivity, be roughly as productive as Mike Danna. So whether or not losing FAU was a huge blow to the roster is not as debatable as, or is more debatable than whether or not they will lose some productivity around the periphery of their roster. FAU, not a first rounder value, right? But he did add something to the roster they will have to replace. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate this sort of thing, hitting the like button does help me out. There are 2 playlists and a video on the screen right now that YouTube thinks you should click on. And who are we to argue with YouTube?